Hello, class. Professor Mandeville back once again. This is lecture number 13 for History 101. And we left off the last lecture with what happened in the very first Congress, 1789. So now we're ready to move forward in the Washington administration. And what's going to happen in 1790... actually in 1789, shortly after he is confirmed as Secretary of the Treasury, George Washington is going to give Alexander Hamilton a very important assignment. He tells Secretary of the Treasury, you got to get our economic ship in shape here. We're struggling. We need to grow. And one of the major obstacles is our credit. So Alexander Hamilton, his very first assignment will be to figure out what to do about the debt. So what he'll do is he'll go through all the federal government's books, figure out exactly what the United States government owes. Then he'll go and travel to all the states, go through their state books, and figure out what all the states owe in debt. Now, while he's doing all this, he discovers something that's very disturbing. He finds out when going through the federal government books, there are a significant number of Revolutionary War officers who still have not been paid for their service during the Rev War. They were given more or less IOUs. This kind of got lost in the shuffle. And remember, under the Articles of Confederation, we're broke anyway. So he reports this to President Washington, and Washington immediately orders that they all be paid, and they could have the option to be paid in land grants, which obviously the United States had plenty of, gaining possession to basically almost everything east of the Mississippi River. So a lot of these Revolutionary War officers took their pay in land, including General Philip Schuyler, who was awarded huge land grants in the state of New York, and other officers did the same thing. So with that taken care of immediately, because that was a pressing issue to the two veterans of the war, Hamilton and Washington, Secretary of the Treasury Hamilton will put together a report he will deliver to Congress in 1790. This will be the first in a series of 3 economic reports delivered by the Secretary of the Treasury to Congress on a yearly basis. In the subject of the first report is the debt. And Hamilton's plan for the debt is it's known as the assumption plan. Now, what he wants to do, and if you take a look at page 188, you can see in figure 9.1 what we actually owed in debt at the time. At the top, in that green box, is what we owed foreign countries, mainly France. We owed nearly $12 million to foreign countries, mainly the French in the form of Rev War bonds. Domestically, to fellow Americans, we owed over $42 million. So the federal debt was basically $54 million. Now, when he investigated the state debts, he discovered that there's another $21.5 million worth of state debt. So his plan is to combine those debts, so assumption of the state debt by the federal government is what he's calling for in this assumption plan, and combine them all, issue brand new government bonds, because if you combine the two debt totals, you're looking at a debt of roughly $75 million. refinance the debt, issue brand new government bonds that would be 20-year bonds, which would then push off having to actually pay back this $75 million debt down the road for 20 years. We'd take that $75 million we received from the sale of these bonds and then immediately turn around and pay off the existing debt. Now, obviously, 20 years down the road with interest, it's going to cost a lot more than $75 million to pay it off, but it buys us 20 years of time to get the economy growing, to get the government established, and get our acts together. So this is what he presents to Congress. Now, Congress has mixed feelings about this because one major critic of the assumption plan is Hamilton's close buddy, James Madison. James Madison has been elected to the House from the state of Virginia. And the reason why he doesn't like the idea of this is his state of Virginia does not have any state debt. So his big problem is the assumption of the state debt by the federal government. He does not believe it'd be fair for the taxpayers of Virginia to pay the debts of other states when his state has no debt. Now, Hamilton tries to convince him that it's the only prudent way to do this, that obviously, yes, some states don't have debt. Some states have tremendous debt. But some of the states, like Massachusetts, their debt was accumulated fighting the Rev War. So it really is a federal debt. They kind of reach a standstill and they go on break in spring for the holidays, like we today. And while they're adjourned, what's going to happen here is Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson is going to invite both Hamilton and Madison to his house, the Monticello. I don't know if you've ever been to the Monticello before, but if you're ever in Charlottesville, Virginia, it's definitely worth spending an afternoon at. An impressive structure that Jefferson designed himself. And when you go there, you'll no doubt see that Madison was no stranger to the Monticello. He lived not too far from there on the Potomac, and he had become such close friends with Thomas Jefferson that Thomas Jefferson built a bedroom for Madison and his wife Dolly, and it was known as the Madison bedroom, and you'll see that if you tour the Monticello. Alexander Hamilton had never been there before. So they're there on break, and at Jefferson's dinner table, Jefferson offers the compromise that will settle this debt assumption plan. Jefferson says to Hamilton and Madison, let's tie into this something else, because at the same time in Congress in 1790, they were debating on where to build the nation's capital. In Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution that gives Congress its powers, one of the clauses says it can create the center of government in an area no larger than 10 square miles to be cut out of existing states and will be the seat of our nation's government. They were debating on where to put that. It was a pretty high priority because one thing I had mentioned about how disorganized the Articles of Confederation were, in the short existence of that document from 1781 to 1788, we moved the nation's capital 5 times. We couldn't make up our minds where it should be. It was in Philadelphia. They didn't like it there. They moved to New York City. They moved to Annapolis. They moved it all over the place. Made us the laughing stocks of foreign diplomats. They never knew where to go to if they were traveling back from their home country, because lo and behold, they'd go to the wrong city upon their return. So it's a pressing problem. And it boiled down to two places that were in the final, that were the finalists to select. Manhattan was a finalist. Alexander Hamilton supported that idea. He argued it only made sense. Lower Manhattan had already evolved as the financial capital of the United States. It's where Wall Street is today and was back then. Northern Manhattan was still uninhabited. It was still forest back in 1790. Hard to believe, but obviously there was no George Washington Bridge and there was nothing up there but woods. So he argued you could easily place the nation's capital on the northern end of Manhattan, and then it'd be in close proximity to the nation's financial capital. Kind of makes sense. Others argued it should be in a more centralized position. And remember, we only had 13 states along the eastern seaboard. So the place where it is today, where they carved out of the state of Maryland, the District of Columbia. That was second in the running. So what Jefferson suggested is Hamilton should throw his support to the site, which is the District of Columbia, where our capital will become. In exchange, Madison will throw his support to the assumption of the debt that he was dead set against. It's a perfect compromise. And it also shows how Thomas Jefferson was a man of vision. By carving out the nation's capital right across the Potomac River from Virginia, he knew in the future Virginia would benefit from this. Because obviously 10 square miles wasn't enough to house all the government buildings, and the overspill of most government buildings from Washington, D.C. went across the Potomac into Virginia. That's where the Pentagon is. That's where both airports that service Washington, D.C. are, and numerous other government buildings are in Virginia. And if you've ever been to D.C. and traveled on their subway system, the majority of the D.C. Metro subway system is in the state of Virginia. So, in the long run, Virginia capitalized big time on having the capital where it's located. So, they go back to Congress, all that happens, Hamilton throws his support to D.C., Madison supports assumption of the debt, and it passes. So, the next thing we want to cover is Hamilton's second economic report to Congress, which happens in 1791. Now, in this particular report, the major pressing problem that Hamilton's facing as Secretary of the Treasury is taking our monetary system and solidifying it into one form of currency. Remember, we had 14 forms. Now, to do this, you're going to have a time period when you take all the old state currencies and the old federal currency and exchange it into one brand new currency. But you have to have a deadline when the old currencies will become worthless and you'll strictly only do business with the brand new form of currency. Now, to successfully do this, Alexander Hamilton proposes that we must create a national bank. Now, he also has some other underlying reasons why we need this national bank. He's already began the process of paying off the debt with the brand new bonds we issued the previous year, and he's had to make payments to foreign nations, including France. They were wondering why the payments, many of them, were coming from state banks, not the National Bank of the United States. And Hamilton had to explain to them, because we don't have a National Bank of the United States to house our money and so forth. and do our financial transactions. So, he argued, now that we're collecting revenue, we need a place to place it, not in all these different state banks. We need a place to do transactions, and we need a clearinghouse to be able to do this monetary transformation. Because he argued if we weren't careful, and we didn't do this in a highly organized fashion, transforming the 14 forms of currency into one, we could have a revolution on our hands. If people felt like they didn't have a proper opportunity to exchange their money before it became worthless and they were, left holding the bag, so to speak, they're not going to be happy and they might grab their guns. This isn't a far-fetched idea, as we'll find out later on in the Washington administration. Hamilton and Washington are going to have to put down a rebellion of whiskey farmers who weren't happy with the government in the famous Whiskey Rebellion, which we'll talk about later. Now, this is debated in Congress. Once again, the number one opponent to the national bank is Hamilton's old friend, James Madison. He argues that Congress does not have the authority to create a national bank. Now, if you look in the back of your book at Article 1, Section 8 in the Constitution, that's where the powers of Congress are spelled out. And it's almost like a grocery list of powers. But granted, none of them specifically say to create a national bank. Now, Alexander Hamilton counters this argument and says, well, it indirectly says that, because one of the powers granted to Congress is to coin money. Then the very last clause of Article 1, Section 8 states that Congress can do all things necessary and proper to carry forth the foregoing powers. That's the so-called necessary and proper clause of the United States Constitution. So, what Hamilton argues is, it is necessary and proper for Congress to create a national bank so it can carry out its power to coin money. That's his argument. It's a great argument. So, the rest of Congress buys into it and it passes with a slim majority. But Madison is still dead set against it. The bill goes to President Washington's desk for a signature, as is the process. Washington's torn. He's not sure what to do. He's heard the argument. So what he does is he instructs Alexander Hamilton and Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, who he knows is best pals with James Madison, to both draft policy papers to deliver to him, giving their arguments for and against. They do, and Hamilton's argument prevails. It makes the most sense to Washington. He signs the bill into law, creating the first national bank of the United States. Now, a couple things about this. This is very, very interesting, because here you have three of the founding fathers torn on the same issue. Washington, Madison, and Hamilton trying to figure out what Article 1, Section 8 in the Constitution really says and means. They helped write the thing and they can't agree on it. The ink's barely dry, and there's a controversy by the three guys who helped write the thing. No wonder it's so difficult to try to interpret what original intent of the founding fathers actually is, when we're a few hundred years removed. Three of the founding fathers had a hard time figuring out what it meant when they're still all alive. So, regardless, we end up at the national bank and we start the process of the currency transformation. So, it brings us to Hamilton's third report to Congress on the economy. And the focus of this one is how slowly industrial development is occurring in the United States. Now, a lot of people thought industrial development would explode here because we were so ripe for development. We hadn't been able to build any industry here when we were British colonies because the British outlawed it in the mercantilist system. That was all reserved to British industrialists back in England. So once we were our own country, everyone thought, factories would just pop up everywhere. Well, the first obstacle to that was the Articles of Confederation and the disasters economically that created. And now we're into 1792, and things are still very slow to develop. So Alexander Hamilton comes up with a plan for industrial development in America. And what his plan calls for is substantial increases in the tariff, our tax system of the time, which taxes foreign imports. He argues, at the very least, we should increase it to 8%. Maybe we should double it to 10%. Maybe we should triple it to 15%. Because he argues if you if you substantially raise the tariff, it'll make foreign-made industrial items much more expensive because they have to pay the tariff, they have to pay the transportation costs from Europe, plus labor is more expensive over there. This will put American industrialists in a prime position to expand factories or build new ones because the items they make here will be much less expensive because they don't pay tariffs, they don't pay the massive transportation costs, and labor is less expensive. So it'll allow American industrialists to sell their items at a greater profit, but still significantly less than the European counterparts, which will lend to economic industrial growth in America. Now, once again, James Madison hates this plan, and so do all of his Southern counterparts, because already the United States is two different worlds. Any industrialization that's taken place is taking place in the North. The South is an agrarian society, and it's all agriculturally related, and the two areas are developing differently. Farmers hate increases in tariffs because they believe it'll create a trade war where Europeans will place higher tariffs on American agricultural products, like we just went through when President Trump increased tariffs on China. They increased tariffs on such thing as soybeans, and farmers in the Midwest couldn't sell their soybean crops. This is what farmers feared all the way back in 1792. So they're dead set against increasing any tariffs because they said it only benefited a select few industrialists, not them. This plan was firmly turned down. So, to sum it up, Alexander Hamilton had two successful economic plans pushed through Congress: the assumption of the debt and the creation of the national bank and transformation of the currency. He lost on his industrial economic development plan, but 2 out of 3 isn't bad. But one other underlying thing that we've been talking about without mentioning it is if you look on page 191 in your book, at the bottom of that page, you have table 9.2 that shows you the evolution of major parties. This is the time period when the two political parties actually come into existence in America. Before, we only had factions, as they were known, the Federalists and Anti-Federalists. Now they're going to develop into full-fledged political parties based on these differences on the interpretation of the Constitution. And if you look at this chart, you can see on one side, we have what they call the Hamiltonians, or as they're officially known, the Federalist Party. That faction turns into a full-fledged party. Major members of the Federalists are, obviously, Alexander Hamilton, President Washington, Vice President John Adams. Now, on the other side of the coin politically, as your book labels them, are the Jeffersonians. Their real official name back then was the Democratic Republicans. Not to be confused with the Democrats or the Republicans that we have today. It's a completely different thing, and you can see how they evolve over time. Now, Democratic Republicans are sort of the rebirth of the states' rights men, or the Anti-Federalists, even though the Anti-Federalists fade away when they lose the argument over the Constitution. There are still people that believe the states have to maintain powers and rights, and that, thus the argument of Madison against the debt assumption and so forth, and overstepping of power like creating the National Bank. The Democratic Republicans were led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. And as we'll find out, they'll elect their very first president in 1800, Thomas Jefferson, to be followed by, after 2 terms, Democratic Republican President James Madison. So, that's the evolution and creation of the 2 political parties of the time, and then obviously over time they'll change and morph into the parties we have today. So, that's it for today. I'm all talked out after delivering all these lectures to both classes. So, I'm going to call her quits. I hope you all have a good Easter tomorrow. And I know you got to celebrate it at home, but be with your family. And most importantly, continue to follow Pause New York. Stay home. We're going to defeat this thing if we all do. So be safe. Be happy tomorrow. I'll see you on Monday. Take care. Bye now.